think I didn't do anything wrong, just shared a blanket with someone I used to know. But my husband said it was betrayal, changed the locks, and left me standing outside my own home with papers in his hand. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I always told myself that marriage meant a little freedom, not a prison, and if my husband couldn't understand that, then maybe the problem was him and not me. My name is Celiora Vane. I'm 34 years old, and I work as an office manager in a mid-sized logistics firm, where every day I balance schedules, solve small conflicts, and keep men who think they're important from losing their tempers. At work, everyone thinks I'm reliable and calm, but at home, it often feels like Michael expects me to shrink into silence, to obey his moods, and to live only within his shadow. That's why I started to enjoy the occasional drink after work with old friends, sometimes even with Ethan, a face from years before. I convinced myself it was harmless, and maybe it was, but the truth is that I enjoyed the way Ethan remembered me before Michael, the way he laughed at my jokes without judgment, and the way he let me feel like I was still a woman who mattered. Michael always asked why I was late, and I always said I had to stay late at the office, which wasn't really a lie, just not the full story. He would sigh, shake his head, and mutter that I cared more about everyone else than my own family, and I would smile and tell him he was overthinking things, that his jealousy was making him miserable. I told myself he was insecure, that his suspicion was his own weakness, and I learned to turn every question into proof of his paranoia. That night started as an ordinary Friday. I stayed later than usual at work, sorting through end-of-week reports and emails. Then Ethan texted me, suggesting a quick drink at the bar near the river. I thought, why not? Just one drink, and I agreed. At the bar, the autumn air was chilly, and we sat outside under the heater. We laughed about the past, about mutual friends, and he told me about his latest failed relationship. I wrapped my coat tighter, and he pulled out a blanket the bar kept for guests on the patio. We shared it across our shoulders, more for warmth than anything else. At least that's what I repeated to myself. When someone snapped a photo of us, I didn't care, because I assumed it was just another stranger. Later, I would learn the photo traveled quickly, passed from one phone to another, until it reached Michael's eyes. At home, Michael asked again why I was late. I told him work had dragged me down, and I didn't want to bore him with details. He asked if I was with anyone, and I smiled softly, saying he was imagining things again. I told him he always made problems where none existed, and he looked at me with that tired expression I had grown used to, a mixture of doubt and sadness. He didn't argue, not then, but his silence was heavier than any fight. I told myself he would get over it, that tomorrow he'd forget, because he always forgave eventually. But when I woke the next morning, he was scrolling his phone in the kitchen, his face pale and rigid. He asked me if I wanted to explain why I was wrapped in a blanket with another man, and I froze. I laughed a little and told him it was nothing, just a silly moment, just comfort on a cold night, nothing serious. He said it looked like intimacy to him. I told him he was ridiculous, that he always saw betrayal where there was none, and that he needed to stop embarrassing both of us with his insecurities. I called my brother Darren later that day and told him what happened. He said Michael was uptight, too strict, and that men like him always made mountains out of molehills. He told me not to worry, that Michael would calm down. That reassurance gave me a sense of power, like I was in the right, like I had done nothing wrong. I even told myself Michael should be grateful I wasn't doing worse, that sharing a blanket was barely even worth mentioning. Still, I noticed Clara, our daughter, watching us with wide eyes whenever Michael and I exchanged sharp words. She never said anything, but her silence was almost accusing, as if she understood more than I wanted her to. That night, Michael didn't touch me, didn't speak more than a few words. He sat in the living room, scrolling on his phone, staring at the floor. I kept telling myself that he was sulking, that he would forgive me soon, but deep down I sensed something had shifted. When I tried to hug him, he stood up and moved away, saying he needed air. I told him he was dramatic, that he was acting like I had done something unforgivable. He looked at me and said quietly that I already had. His words cut deeper than I expected, but I masked it with another smile, telling him he would regret saying that when he realized how silly he sounded. The next morning, I found him gone before sunrise, leaving only a note saying he'd be home late. I poured myself coffee and repeated the same mantra in my head. I didn't cheat, I didn't betray, I didn't do anything wrong. But when I checked my phone, a message from a coworker appeared with the same photo attached, and beneath it, the caption, "Guess your marriage isn't as perfect as you say." My heart pounded, not because I thought I had done anything terrible, but because I hated that the world saw me as guilty before I even explained. Michael's silence was louder than shouting, his absence sharper than any insult. I still believed I could twist it, control the story, and make everyone see my side. Yet in my heart I knew the photo was already spreading, and the judgment was already forming, even inside my own home. The restaurant where everything had unfolded was nothing special, just a casual riverside bar with worn wooden tables and an old neon sign that buzzed faintly in the night. I had gone there because Ethan said he needed company, because he said he was lonely and tired of his endless cycle of failed relationships. I told myself I was being kind, just a friend offering support, and when he draped the blanket across our shoulders, I convinced myself it was only practical. The air was cold, my hands numb, and we were laughing at some silly memory from our college years when I felt the warmth of his arm brush against mine under the fabric. I told myself it didn't mean anything, but I didn't push him away either. It was comfort, I repeated in my mind, nothing more. Still, when someone at the bar snapped that photo, I smiled as if it was harmless, never imagining it would travel so quickly. By the time I realized how many eyes had seen it, the story had already formed without me. When Michael confronted me, it was at a family dinner, which made the humiliation sharper. He sat at the table across from me, his phone on the wood like a weapon, and asked me if I wanted to explain why my shoulder was pressed against Ethan's, why we looked like more than just friends. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from guilt, but from anger that he dared to question me in front of everyone. I told him he was being ridiculous, that he was humiliating me in front of my own family. I laughed, forcing the others to join in, as if his jealousy was some tired joke. Darren smirked and said Michael always took things too seriously, that men couldn't stand seeing women have a little fun. My husband's mother, Margaret, however, glared at me with eyes that burned, whispering that I was tearing the family apart. Her words stung, but I told her she was old-fashioned, that she didn't understand how harmless things really were. I could see Michael's face tighten, his jaw set, his hands trembling under the table. He didn't raise his voice, but his silence cut through the chatter like a blade. I sipped my wine and told everyone that if a blanket on a cold night was considered cheating, then perhaps people had forgotten what real betrayal looked like. My words were smooth, dismissive, and I felt powerful when a few chuckled awkwardly, agreeing just to ease the tension. Inside, though, I knew the photo painted a different truth, one I couldn't erase. I told myself that as long as I held my head high, the world would believe me. That night, when we returned home, Michael sat in the living room while I went upstairs. He didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't argue. His silence unnerved me more than anger would have. I called Darren again, telling him that Michael was sulking like a child, refusing to see reason. Darren told me to ignore him, that Michael would cave eventually. He reminded me that men always came back once they realized their pride couldn't keep them warm at night. His confidence gave me reassurance, but as I glanced at Clara, who lingered quietly at the top of the stairs, I felt an unease I couldn't shake. She looked at me with eyes full of questions she was too afraid to ask. The following morning, Michael left early, leaving me to prepare Clara for school. As I brushed her hair, she whispered softly that Daddy seemed sad. I told her he was just tired, that grown-ups sometimes needed space, but the doubt in her small face pierced deeper than Michael's silence. I wanted to believe she didn't understand, yet I feared she understood everything. Children see more than adults realize, and Clara's silence became another form of judgment I couldn't manipulate away. When I returned home later that day, I found the lock stiff against my key. At first, I thought it was my mistake, but when the second attempt failed, I realized the locks had been changed. Panic rose in my chest, but I quickly turned it into outrage, pounding on the door until Michael opened it. He stood there calm, almost cold, holding a small envelope. He said I could find somewhere else to stay until things were sorted, and he handed me the envelope with the kind of stillness that scared me more than shouting. Inside were separation papers, typed neatly, with my name at the top. I told him he was cruel, unreasonable, destroying our family over nothing. He simply said he was protecting himself and Clara. Then he closed the door, leaving me on the porch like an intruder in my own life. I called Darren again, furious, and told him Michael had locked me out. Darren laughed, said Michael was playing games, and that I should just wait until he calmed down. But Margaret, when she found out, called me directly and told me I had done this to myself. She said no decent man would share his home with a woman who treated marriage like a joke. I tried to argue, to say Michael was overreacting, but her voice broke through my excuses. She said even Clara knew the truth, that children could feel betrayal even when adults tried to hide it. I slammed the phone down, shaking, still convincing myself that everyone was wrong but me. That night, I sat in my car outside the house, staring at the windows glowing with light, imagining Michael and Clara inside without me. I told myself he was staging a show, that he would regret this once he realized how far he had gone. But in the pit of my stomach, I felt the first flicker of something I refused to name. The realization that maybe, for once, I couldn't twist the story enough to make myself look innocent. I told myself tomorrow I would find a way to fix it, that I could still spin it into a misunderstanding. Yet, as the cold air seeped through the glass, I understood Michael was no longer playing the part I had written for him. I stood on the porch staring at the locked door, the separation notice still trembling in my hand, and told myself over and over that Michael was being cruel and unreasonable, that this was just another one of his dramatic tantrums. I knocked again, harder this time, but the house remained silent except for the muffled sound of Clara's footsteps somewhere inside. I wanted to believe she was coming to open the door, but she didn't, and the truth settled heavy in my chest. He had shut me out of my own home. I dialed Darren immediately, letting my voice shake as I told him Michael had locked me out and shoved papers into my hand like I was some kind of criminal. Darren laughed at first, said Michael was bluffing, said men loved to threaten but rarely followed through. His tone made me feel like maybe I was the sane one, the one holding everything together while Michael unraveled. He told me to stay strong, to act like none of this bothered me, because eventually Michael would realize he needed me more than I needed him. His words comforted me for a moment, but when I hung up, the empty driveway and the quiet house loomed over me like proof that Darren's confidence wasn't enough to make this nightmare vanish. That evening, I drove aimlessly, telling myself I didn't care, that if Michael wanted to play games, then I would win by refusing to break. I stopped by a friend's place and stayed until late, laughing louder than I felt and insisting I was free, not abandoned. Yet even as I spoke, I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for a message from Michael that never came. When I finally returned, the house was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and it felt less like a home and more like a fortress I no longer belonged to. I told myself I would not beg, I would not grovel, because I hadn't done anything wrong. Still, I sat in my car for nearly an hour, staring at the front door, hoping it might open on its own. The next day, I returned in the afternoon, when I knew Clara would be home from school. I knocked softly, imagining her rushing to greet me, but it was Michael who answered. He cracked the door just enough to slide an envelope through. His voice was calm, almost detached, as he told me it contained a list of temporary visitation schedules for Clara and instructions from his lawyer. I laughed bitterly, telling him this was insane, that he was turning our daughter into a pawn. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just repeated that everything was explained inside the letter. I tried to push against the door, but he shut it quickly, leaving me outside again. I shouted that he was cruel, that Clara needed her mother, but I knew my voice carried into the neighborhood, and already I saw curtains shifting across the street. When I finally opened the envelope, my stomach twisted. The papers were formal, cold, and full of legal language I didn't fully understand. Words like custody, visitation, and separation of assets jumped out at me, and for the first time, I felt the edges of panic. I called Darren again, but this time his laughter was thin, uncertain. He told me not to worry, that Michael couldn't possibly mean it, that courts didn't take children from their mothers unless something truly terrible had happened. His words gave me a shaky kind of hope, but Margaret's voice haunted me still. I knew she would support Michael every step of the way, whispering poison in Clara's ears and painting me as a selfish, reckless woman. Later that week, I managed to catch Clara outside when Michael brought her home from school. She saw me waiting by the curb and froze, her small hands clutching her backpack straps. I knelt and told her I missed her, that Daddy was confused, that he was just tired and angry, but everything would be fine soon. She nodded, but her eyes didn't light up the way they used to. Michael stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching. I told Clara I loved her, that she would see me soon, and I waved as Michael ushered her inside. The door closed again, and I stood alone in the cold. That night, I tried calling Michael's phone, but he didn't answer. I left messages, long ones, begging, accusing, threatening, then apologizing in circles, anything to get a reaction. He never replied. Instead, another envelope arrived in the mail the next morning, this one from his lawyer's office, stamped and official. It explained that until further notice, Michael had full control of the house and custody arrangements were being reviewed. My hand shook as I read it, but I forced myself to believe this was temporary. I told myself that lawyers were just tools, that Michael was using paperwork as a scare tactic, and that he would come to his senses. Yet every line of that document felt like stone, unyielding and deliberate. I confided in one of my co-workers the following day, hoping for sympathy. Instead, she gave me a look that was half pity and half judgment. She said maybe Michael had a right to feel betrayed, that photos told their own stories. Her words burned, and I snapped that people loved to gossip about things they didn't understand. But her expression told me she, like so many others, had already chosen sides. The humiliation gnawed at me more than Michael's silence. It wasn't just my husband I was fighting now. It was every whisper, every glance, every shift in tone when people spoke to me. When I returned to the house again the following weekend, I tried to push past Michael when he opened the door a crack. He blocked me with surprising calm, telling me this was no longer my home until matters were resolved. I screamed that he had no right, that he couldn't erase me from my own life. He simply looked at me with steady eyes and said the court would decide. His certainty rattled me more than anything else had. I realized then he wasn't bluffing, and he wasn't waiting for me to come crawling back. He was moving forward without me. That night, I sat in my car again, parked under the dark streetlight, staring at the glowing windows where Clara was eating dinner with her father. I repeated the same lie to myself. He was overreacting. This would pass. I hadn't really done anything wrong. But the papers in my hand said otherwise, and the silence behind the locked door made me wonder if maybe the truth was finally beyond my control. I tried to keep up appearances even as the walls of my life began to close in around me, because if people saw me as calm and confident, then maybe they would believe my version of events. At work, I smiled more than usual, made jokes at the copier, and insisted to anyone who asked that Michael and I were simply working through a rough patch. But whispers still followed me. A coworker who once invited me to lunch now avoided eye contact, and I overheard two others talking about how a blanket doesn't usually mean nothing. I wanted to scream that it really had been nothing, but instead I straightened my back and walked past them, pretending I was above their gossip. At family gatherings, however, the pretending grew harder. Michael rarely attended now, and when he did, he sat stiffly in the corner, speaking only to Clara and his mother. People would look between us, waiting for some kind of reconciliation, but none came. I filled the silence with stories about work or Darren's latest antics, while Michael's eyes stayed fixed on his plate. During one Sunday dinner at my parents' house, Darren tried to lighten the mood by teasing Michael, saying he should learn to relax, that Celiora just had friends who cared about her. I laughed along, grateful for the defense, but Margaret immediately cut in. She told Darren he was enabling bad behavior, that Michael deserved respect as a husband and father. Her words sliced through the room, leaving everyone tense and quiet. My own mother shifted uncomfortably, clearly unwilling to take sides, while my father pretended to focus on his food. Clara sat silently, picking at her plate, her little shoulders hunched as though the weight of our arguments pressed down on her. I looked at her and felt an unexpected pang of guilt, but I quickly buried it under another layer of justification. I told myself she was too young to really understand, that she would forget all of this soon enough. Later that week, I tried to reclaim control by meeting friends at a cafe and retelling the story with myself as the victim. I said Michael had always been controlling, always suspicious, and now he was using one photograph to justify locking me out and turning Clara against me. Some nodded along, but I could feel the doubt in their faces. One even asked softly if maybe Michael's reaction meant he had been hurt more deeply than I admitted. I brushed it off, insisting he was dramatic, but the question stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my certainty. At the office, Michael's absence from family life started to leak into my professional world. My boss asked quietly if everything was all right at home, saying he had overheard gossip about lawyers in custody. I forced a smile and said, people love to exaggerate, but I left the conversation with my stomach churning. The more I tried to control the narrative, the less control I seemed to have. Every whisper, every glance felt like another verdict passed against me, and I hated that Michael's silence gave people room to invent their own truths. One evening, determined to prove I still had power, I showed up at Clara's school unannounced, hoping to take her to ice cream before Michael arrived. But he was already there, waiting near the entrance, holding Clara's hand. He looked at me with quiet certainty and told me in a calm voice that it wasn't my day. I said he was cruel, that he was stealing time from me, but Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled closer to him. I wanted to believe she still loved me the same, but in that moment I saw how safe she felt at his side. Michael didn't argue, didn't shout. He simply guided her away while I stood frozen, humiliated in front of other parents. Later that night, I cried in my car, not because of Clara's tears, but because people had seen me lose. At another family dinner, things boiled over. Margaret told me directly that I had humiliated her son and shattered their family. I snapped back that Michael had always been weak, always jealous, and that he was the one tearing Clara apart by dragging lawyers into the mess. Darren jumped in to defend me again, but this time even he sounded uncertain, his voice lacking its usual confidence. My father finally spoke, telling us all to stop, that the constant fighting was poisoning everyone. But the silence after his words made it clear that nothing had been solved. I left that evening feeling more isolated than ever, yet still clinging to the belief that I could turn it all around. The breaking point came days later when I checked my mail and found an official packet stamped with the court seal. Inside was a petition for temporary custody, filed by Michael. The words blurred as I read them, but I understood enough. He was making his move, and this time it wasn't just threats. My heart pounded, and for the first time I felt true fear. I called Darren in a panic, but he stammered, unable to give me the comfort I expected. He told me courts could be unpredictable, that maybe I should take this seriously. His hesitation made me realize I was standing alone now, my allies dwindling one by one. That evening, when I tried to confront Michael outside the house, I shouted that he was destroying Clara's childhood, that he was brainwashing her. He looked at me calmly, his lawyer standing beside him, and said he was protecting her. His certainty rattled me more than any insult could have. Clara peeked from behind him, her face pale, and I reached for her, but stopped when she turned away. I screamed that he was turning her against me, but my words echoed into the night with no effect. As I stood there, shaking with rage and fear, Michael's lawyer handed me a folder. Inside were documents outlining custody schedules, financial accounts, and notes that made it clear Michael had been preparing this for weeks. I realized with a sinking heart that while I had been spinning stories and seeking sympathy, he had been building a case brick by brick. The world I thought I controlled was crumbling, and for the first time, I understood that my excuses might not be enough to save me. I sat in the small waiting room of the legal office, with my arms crossed, staring at the bland beige walls and trying to convince myself that this was all still a scare tactic, that Michael couldn't possibly intend to follow through with everything he had threatened. I had told so many people that he was bluffing, that he was too soft to truly fight me, and for weeks I believed my own words. But as soon as his lawyer called my name and invited me inside, the pit in my stomach reminded me that this was no bluff. Michael sat at the long polished table already, papers stacked neatly in front of him, his lawyer calm and professional at his side. He didn't look at me with anger, which I might have been able to dismiss. Instead, he looked at me with a cold certainty that made my throat tighten. I started by laughing, telling them this had gone far enough, that dragging lawyers into a misunderstanding was both petty and cruel. Michael didn't react. His lawyer slid a packet toward me, explaining that Michael had secured temporary custody rights for Clara and had taken steps to separate our finances until the matter was resolved. I felt my chest tighten, my hands clench, because it wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a reality carefully constructed in black and white. I tried to speak, to argue, but every sentence I offered sounded weaker than the last. I said he was ruining our family, and his lawyer responded calmly that he was protecting himself and his daughter from further instability. The words stung because they were spoken so gently, so logically, leaving no space for the emotion I clung to. When I returned to my car, I called Darren again, desperate for reassurance. He sounded tired this time, his voice low and uncertain. He told me courts usually sided with mothers, but admitted Michael seemed unusually prepared. That admission chilled me more than the documents had. For the first time, Darren didn't laugh it off, didn't tell me Michael was bluffing. It felt like even my brother was beginning to doubt me. I told myself he was wrong, that Michael's calm exterior was just a mask, but the more I repeated it, the less I believed it. At home, well, not my home anymore, but the apartment I had hastily rented, I stared at the bank app on my phone and saw the joint accounts locked, access denied. Panic surged through me. Michael had frozen them, just as the papers said. I called the bank demanding answers, but they repeated what his lawyer had written. Funds were temporarily secured until a formal division could be determined. I felt humiliated, powerless, as though every move I made was being anticipated and countered. I threw the phone onto the couch, my hands shaking, and told myself I would not let him win. Later that week, during one of the scheduled visitations, Clara came to stay with me for the afternoon. I tried to make it special, bought her favorite snacks, even took her to the park, but she seemed distant. She asked quietly why Daddy was so upset, Why people were saying we weren't a family anymore. I tried to smile and told her Daddy was just angry, that he was confused and trying to punish me, but the words sounded hollow even to my own ears. Clara looked down at the ground, swinging her legs on the park bench, and whispered that she wished we would stop fighting. Her small voice cracked something in me, but instead of admitting my fault, I hugged her tightly and promised her things would go back to normal soon. Deep down, I knew I was lying. The family divisions widened as the legal process deepened. Margaret refused to speak to me at all now, sending every communication through Michael. My own mother tried to remain neutral, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice when she asked why I hadn't been honest from the beginning. Even Darren grew quieter, no longer rushing to my defense in public. I told myself they were weak, that they were abandoning me out of fear of Michael's cold determination, but in truth, I could see the tide turning against me. Every time Michael presented another document, another legal receipt of action taken, I felt my ground shrinking. At the next formal meeting, Michael's lawyer calmly presented evidence of my manipulations, subtle records of my gaslighting, and even witness statements from friends who had been present at the bar. Seeing my own words and actions laid out so clearly made me flush with shame, but I hid it behind anger. I snapped that they were twisting everything, that people misunderstood me, but deep inside I knew the picture looked damning. They had pieced together every little lie I had told to make Michael seem paranoid, and now those lies were stacked like bricks in a wall against me. When the meeting ended, Michael stood to leave and finally looked at me, his expression steady and unyielding. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't throw any of my words back at me. He simply gathered his papers and left, as though the case spoke for itself. That hurt more than shouting would have, because it meant he no longer needed to fight me directly. He had the law on his side. I sat there alone in the quiet room, the weight of the documents pressing down on me, realizing I had underestimated him in every possible way. That night, I lay awake in the apartment, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything. For weeks I had convinced myself that I held the power, that Michael was weak, emotional, and easily manipulated. But the truth had unfolded differently. He had been steady, calculating, moving with purpose, while I distracted myself with stories and excuses. Now, with every legal document filed and every account locked, he was reshaping our lives in ways I could no longer control. I told myself I would fight back, but even as I whispered the words in the dark, I knew the fight was slipping from my hands. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, a place where voices echoed not because of volume, but because of the weight of what was being decided. I walked in, wearing my best dress, head held high, determined to show everyone I was still in control. I told myself appearances mattered more than facts, that if I looked confident and spoke clearly, people would believe me over Michael's cold, silent posture. He was already there, seated beside his lawyer, papers stacked neatly in front of him, as if they were weapons more powerful than anything I could say. He didn't look at me when I entered, and that absence of attention hurt more than if he had glared. I sat down across from him, my lawyer beside me, though his presence felt flimsy compared to the steady authority radiating from Michael's side of the table. The judge began with formalities, then turned to Michael's lawyer, who presented everything like clockwork. Photos, timelines, accounts, custody arrangements, all laid out in precise order. Each document was like a nail hammered into the structure of Michael's case, and I could feel the walls closing around me. When it was my turn to speak, I told the court that sharing a blanket was not cheating, that my husband had exaggerated a meaningless moment and destroyed our family over pride. I insisted I had done nothing wrong, that I was the victim of his controlling nature. But as the words left my mouth, I could hear the hollowness in them. Even I didn't believe them anymore, though I forced myself to smile as if I did. The judge asked questions, and each one cut deeper. Why had I lied about where I was that night? Why had I allowed the photograph to spread unchecked instead of clarifying immediately? Why had I turned the confrontation into public humiliation rather than addressing Michael privately? My answers stumbled, circling back to the same excuse. It was nothing, just comfort, just a blanket. I repeated the word so many times it began to sound absurd even to me. Michael didn't interrupt, didn't accuse, didn't even raise his voice. He simply let the evidence sit there, speaking louder than I ever could. His lawyer read statements from friends who had been at the bar, who confirmed how intimate it had looked, how I had leaned against Ethan with a smile that wasn't platonic. Each word struck like a hammer, and I wanted to scream that they were twisting the truth, but the more I denied, the weaker I sounded. Then came the financial records, proof that Michael had secured accounts to protect Clara's future, records showing he had already taken steps to ensure her stability if custody shifted in his favor. I argued it was manipulation, that he was trying to punish me, but the judge seemed to see it differently. Where I looked unstable, defensive, and desperate, Michael appeared calm, methodical, and protective. My lawyer whispered for me to stay quiet, but silence felt like surrender, and so I spoke again, insisting Michael was turning Clara against me. Yet, when Clara's name was mentioned, the judge reminded me sharply that this was about her well-being, not my pride. Clara wasn't in the courtroom, but her presence lingered in every word. Statements from teachers described her withdrawn behavior, her distraction in class, her whispered worries about her parents. Reading those words broke something in me, though I tried to hide it. I wanted to say she would be fine, that children are resilient, but the truth was staring back at me. My daughter had suffered through every excuse I had made, every attempt to twist the narrative. And Michael, quietly and steadily, had documented it all, not with anger but with patience. The final blow came when the judge read the recommendation aloud: temporary custody to Michael, financial control secured under his management, and a visitation schedule for me. My chest tightened so hard I thought I couldn't breathe. I wanted to shout that this was unfair, that I was her mother, and deserved more. But the words stuck in my throat. Michael finally looked at me then, not with triumph or bitterness, but with something worse: pity. It was the look of a man who had stopped fighting because he had already won, not through rage, but through reason. When the judge's gavel fell, the sound echoed like the closing of a door I would never open again. Papers were signed, schedules handed over, and in a blur, I realized everything had shifted. I was no longer the center of control, no longer the one shaping the story. Michael had dismantled every excuse I built, every layer of denial, until all that remained was the truth I had tried so hard to avoid. I walked out of the courtroom numb, the folder of visitation schedules heavy in my hand, as though it contained not just paper but the shattered pieces of the life I once believed I controlled. Outside, I stood on the courthouse steps as people passed by, their conversations carrying on like nothing monumental had happened. To them, I was just another woman clutching legal documents, but to me, the world had collapsed. I told myself again that I hadn't really cheated, that I hadn't done anything truly wrong, but the words rang empty, drifting into the cold air with no weight at all. Michael walked past me without stopping, holding Clara's school photo tucked inside one of his files, his lawyer beside him. He didn't look back, and for the first time I realized he never would. I stood there until the sky darkened, my heels aching, the courthouse lights flickering on, and I understood the final truth. My words had no power here. The law had spoken, and it sided with him. Everything I thought I could control had slipped away, and there was no epilogue, no last twist to rewrite the ending. Just silence, cold and final, like the slam of a lock shutting me out of my own home all over again. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.